So, welcome. I have come to South London to see Chris Manning. And Chris Manning and I met through the Clockmakers Company. And I thought it would be a worthwhile coming to see Chris because Chris has just moved from Canada through to London.
Yep.
And Chris has an extraordinary range of skills which really started with engraving. Is that correct?
That was probably the thing I'm using the most now
Right.
that I started with, but I actually started in jewelry making over 25 years ago now. And engraving, particularly guilloche work, is something that I brought into my jewelry work quite a long time ago.
Right. So let's get right to it. So
Yes.
what brought you into the world of watches, which is how we met?
So watches are something that I've always been fascinated with. I had a cousin who was maybe 10 or probably 15 or 16 years older than me, and he and his mates used to buy estate sales. And somebody would take the silver, somebody would take the paintings, he would take the clocks and watches.
Right.
And so whenever I stayed with his parents, I was the one who was relegated to his bedroom because I was the only one that could tolerate the noise of partially functioning clocks and watches running all the time. And so as a kid, I remember going through those objects and just being absolutely fascinated with them. Come along 20 odd years, and I happen to have a whole set of skills now as a jeweler that allow me to make things which I hadn't thought 20 years earlier I ever could have made. And because of my fascination with watches, I thought, let's get into this. It's an interesting world, and it's a little bit more challenging than the jewelry making that I was doing before.
And I think what's interesting is your base here is a studio.
Yes.
So it's a workshop, a creative space, and also your home as
Yes.
well. So you are living and breathing
Yes.
all of these skills.
Absolutely. When I wake up in the morning, there is clocks and watches around me. When I go to sleep at night, there are clocks and watches around me. My studio is quite literally in the next room. So it's easy for me to, at any time of night and day, actually get to working and do what I need to do.
Right. We talked about your jewellery skills, but was there a turning point at which you said, I want to look at timing devices, watches? And you said about that childhood life, but was there one moment where you moved? Because you've got some incredible skills. I mean, I've seen some of your work with pens, and I've seen some of your work, as you said, in jewellery. But was there a point at which you knew watches were going to be your thing?
I would say about 10 years ago.
Right.
I was actually recovering from some major surgery, and I was going through the BHI distance learning course.
Right.
I couldn't do any work. I couldn't make things. For around 6 months, I couldn't do anything. And so I spent that 6 months learning about how to repair watches because I thought, oh, this would be an interesting skill to have. And as I was going through that, I realized there's absolutely no reason why I should be buying these things from other people. I shouldn't be buying cases from other people. I shouldn't be buying dials from other people. These are all things that I can make. And as I was meeting more and more people in the industry, I was realizing that so many of people that I now consider my colleagues didn't have those skills. And so they were talking to other people to have cases made, to have dials made and things like that. And I thought, well, I can do all of those things. So now all I need to do, I just have to be able to make watches, which sounds kind of ridiculous, but at the end of the day, it's not a huge stretch to start making watch parts from some of the tools and some of the other items that I was already making as a jeweler.
And I think what's interesting is, as we started at the beginning of this conversation, you came from a craft jewellery perspective. So manufacturing objects, making things materialise was not foreign to you. You had the tools,
Yes.
you had the equipment. We've
Yes.
seen your equipment next door, your lathes and everything like that. So for you, it was more a case of, as you said, I need one of those, I'll just make it.
And that's the way that I've always thought. And in fact, there's a multi-thousand-year tradition of jewelers making the tools that they need.
Yeah.
500 years ago, Cellini sitting in his workshop in Florence, he isn't buying tools from somebody else. He's making his tools. And that's a tradition that's continued on. Even when you buy tools today from a Rio Grande or a Cookson's Gold, you're buying a tool and 9 times out of 10, you're immediately modifying it. So even tools that we can purchase today, we're modifying. So I had this tradition of making a lot of my tools, making all of my jewelry. I wasn't buying pre-made jewelry from anybody. I was making everything bespoke. I've made my own CNC machines to be able to facilitate making pens and other things like that. So when I look at a thing, and I want to make it, I don't think, oh, that's impossible to make. I think, okay, that somebody made that. right?
Yeah.
You know, some like a Swiss person in their cottage 300 years ago was sitting there making parts for a watch. Well, I have a far more precise lathe than they could have ever dreamed of having, right? Better optics than they could have ever dreamed of having. I have all of the knowledge of hundreds of years of horology available to me. Why can't I make those things?
And I think that's a good point, because I think when people look at an object now, they think it's manufactured almost by magic. But
Yes.
as you said, these things originally were created by people with very, very basic tools.
Yes.
As you said, without the optics. Because I think that's why I say to people in watchmaking that, like, can you see what you're doing?
Yeah.
You know, without the optics, and then of course without the tomes, and of course the internet. And probably like me, you're on the verge of, you know, the internet was there, but it was really obscure. So
Sure.
books, and I
Sure.
still think to this day there's a lot of things in books, in printed material, that actually are not on the internet.
Well, I mean, there's 30 odd boxes of books in that other room that I haven't put on bookshelves yet. So yes, I agree with that. And it's funny. There's an Arthur C. Clarke quote that I love, and he said, "Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic." And I firmly believe that any ancient enough technology is as well, because most people don't appreciate how the things are made that they're made. You know, they look at a wedding ring, or they look at a necklace or something like that, and they don't understand how to do that. I love walking through the V&A's jewelry vault, because they have a few pieces of jewelry there, and they show you each individual component and where they come from, and then they show you the finished piece as it goes along. And I love walking people through that, and they're like, well, wait a minute, where does that little curly piece of wire go? It's like, oh, that's all these little things around there. And it's an interesting exercise to walk non-makers through the manufacture of something like that, because all of a sudden the light comes on, and they're like, oh, that's how you build these elements
And
together.
I think also, I mean, maybe you'll disagree with me, but I think it's injection molding. I think people think you squeeze some material into there and it comes out there. Whereas you said, I've seen someone make a case,
Yeah.
you know, and it's building up layers. You know,
Yes.
they start with one ring, and we
Yes.
add another ring, and we
Yes.
solder that, and then we finish
Yes.
it. And I think people just assume that the whole thing is one amorphous blob,
And that's
that,
right.
that almost like a computer graphic, and there it is. So I think it is unlocking or reverse engineering, but I think
Yes.
you've done that in a other way, because you started making things
Yes.
from one dimension into three. So that's really interesting. Can you describe to me the watchmaking process for you? So you have a concept or an idea. What's the first part you start with?
The first is the dial. Right. Absolutely.
Okay,
You
interesting.
have to have a dial, and if you don't know where things are on your dial, it's nearly impossible to figure out where to go from there. So, for instance, I'm working on two designs for my next watch. One is a standard dial that everybody's going to recognize, the minute and hour hand in the center. The second as a sub-second dial at 6 o'clock. Very, very standard time-only watch. Well, I'm also working on a regulator version of that dial, where the hour hand is now moved to the 12 o'clock position in a sub-dial. And you have to sit there and figure out, okay, where is that going to go? And how does that affect, you know, how is that going to affect the movement underneath? And once you've made that decision, then you can start to look at the movement and say, okay, first off, is this actually going to work, right? Because even though the aesthetics of the dial work perfectly, oh, okay, no, this needs to be moved a 0.5 millimeter higher because it needs room for these wheels to make the hour hand move. So you have to start with that dial, and that's really going to be, first off, that's the soul of what people are looking at. That's the thing that everybody sees all the time, and that's what they're going to be interacting with on their watch, right? So that's an important element of it. But from a watchmaker's point of view, if you don't know where things are going on the dial, you can't work on the movement yet, because you just don't know where things are going to have to go.
Exactly, and I think people often don't understand that. People talk about, oh, this watch is too thick, or this, but sometimes you have to fit the layers of movement. And where we had an interesting conversation recently, I think in a pub in Marylebone, we were talking about movements, and you started saying to me, well, I can do this on a movement. Well, actually, if I change the plate there, and that's where your skills go from, oh, we're looking at the whole concept of the watch, the case, the dial, and how the dial moves from one person.
Yes.
And I think that's really rare now, because most people commercially have to buy a movement which dictates the dial, which dictates the case, and we're all, whereas what you're doing is going the other way around and saying, well, that's the almost perception of the watch. Because I agree, I think the dial is the face of the watch.
Yes.
I think if you had someone, they've got no head, you don't know
It
who that
doesn't-
person
yes,
is.
that's right.
But if you've got the face, I know who that is.
Yes,
so
exactly.
I think the dial starts with everything. And I think once you start moving things around, and I've seen some really interesting work that you've talked about, where you start moving that and you go, oh, that's really clever.
Yes.
But once you do that, you're into a whole world again. And that's why a bespoke watchmaker, and I'm going to say that because I mean you are doing things bespoke and at one time, really makes a difference because you're looking almost from the whole concept in terms of how you execute that watch.
Absolutely, and you know, obviously from there, once you have that, you can start to figure out, okay, what am I going to do with the movement? Now, in my case, I haven't designed this movement entirely from scratch myself. I'm taking a classic Omega movement and I'm using the gear train from a classic Omega movement. And it's a great movement. There are millions and millions of them out there. They still work today, 60 years later, right? Really great. The power, you know, they engineered them very, very well. They figured out all the power, you know, requirements and making sure that it was super efficient. But I'm rebuilding all the plates. I'm re-engineering where things go because it fits better with what I'm trying to do. But it's also a nice thin movement. So I've got a lot of space in my case to do things like, okay, do I want to add a complication to it later, right? I can add a moon phase to it in the future, and I've still got room to sort of maneuver in there because they made a nice thin movement.
But don't you agree with me when we see lots of interesting complications come on the market from some of, let's say, the bigger brands?
Yeah.
You and I know, once you put that moment apart, that actually the gear train, you know where that's come from.
Yes,
I mean, I've done a video recently, and you may have seen it or may not, about the 7750.
Sure.
Which I think was a genius movement.
Brilliant movement.
Yeah. And I think people don't realise, and I'm trying to remember, maybe you will more than I, but is it the 7001? But there's a 7 series which is non-chronograph.
Right.
And so many watches are built with that basis of that 7750 movement.
And even if you take a look at like Habring, for instance, he's taken a 7750 and he stripped most of that movement out. He stripped off the automatic component from the back of it, right? Because that adds a lot of thickness to that movement. You strip off the automatic and now all of a sudden it's 2/3 of the thickness that it was before. But it's got a huge amount of power because it was designed to run a chronograph.
Yeah.
Right? And he can then say, well, I don't want the chronograph in there. Well, that's great. You strip out the chronograph parts. Now you've all of a sudden given this watch a huge amount of power to do other things, and so it's a brilliant movement to be able to do.
And I think, I mean, I've met Richard. Have you ever met Richard?
I've never had a chance.
Right, he's a really nice guy,
Sure.
very quiet. But when you talk to him, he is very pragmatic. He said,
Sure.
well, why wouldn't I use that?
Absolutely.
In terms of it works. Why would I start
Absolutely.
trying to not reinvent the wheel, but why would I, as you said, because I think most people don't understand that power is the key. If you've got a good smooth power delivery, there's so much you can take from that.
Absolutely.
And I think that's where a good watchmaker in today's climate works.
Yes.
They understand what's available.
Yes.
And then they use their skill to focus on adding something more that gives them something different.
And that's exactly right. And with this Omega movement, again, super well engineered, incredibly well engineered. There are also piles of them available, and there's even new old stock parts still available. So I can refinish them, I can do all of that work, but if there's something I don't want to have to make, I don't want to have to play around right now with making all of the wheels in the train. But I don't have to. I've got them all available to me, and I can. And so maybe sometime down the road I decide that I'm going to, because I want to change something up a little bit. But again, that's not, while that's an important part of it, the overall vision of the watch, the way that the movement looks, the average person looking at my watch movement is not going to recognize it as an Omega movement. So there's still enough of my design and my DNA in there. But again, I've taken advantage of the engineering from decades ago that Omega put into it.
But let's be honest about it. Outside in the street here, the modern cars that are driving around, and I know. I mean, I went to the Mini factory once. The interiors were coming, I think, from Czechoslovakia.
Sure.
The wiring harnesses were
Sure.
coming from else. I mean,
Sure.
there is very little that is handmade by one person anymore.
And they share their platform with BMW as well. So
Yeah,
you get an X1 and it's got the same stuff in it as a Mini Clubman or whatever, right? So
Yeah.
it's certainly there's a strong tradition in this industry of using the best parts from different places, and I think that's important. I don't think, especially as a one-man shop, I can't design everything from scratch, and I don't think it's practical to. I don't think that my watch would be as good if I sat down and designed everything myself from scratch. So, I'm going to take advantage of the best of the industry, and I'm going to use it for myself.
Yeah, I think that's a wise choice, and also gives your customers or your clients, I'm going to call them that because it's a better word, something that they can rely on and work.
Sure.
Which I think is great.
And you know what? If sadly, I'm not going to live forever. And 100 years from now, somebody's going to be able to take this watch to any competent watchmaker in the world. They're going to be able to repair it and service it.
Yeah.
In fact, they'll probably still be able to find parts for, things like the wheels and stuff like that. They'll still be able to find those parts. I respect a lot of what's being done in the industry with new materials, new technology. And it's great that there are people trying to innovate things like silicon hairsprings and whatnot. It's not practical for me. And at the end of the day, I'm not going to be around forever to service these watches, and there won't be a company around forever to service my watches. I want something that, again, any watchmaker, 200 years from now is going to be able to service. Take a look at Seth Kennedy, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
He only services watches from pre-1850.
Yeah.
Those watches are all totally serviceable by a competent watchmaker today.
Yeah.
And he's a great example of that. I want the Seth Kennedy of 200 years from now to be able to sit down with my watch and go, oh, excellent. I know how to repair this. I know how to service this watch.
Yeah.
And I don't want them to go, silicon hairspring. Nobody stopped. We stopped using those in 2135,
well, and
nobody's made them.
I think we often have this discussion about modern supplies. I do with
Sure.
one of my watch repairers. And what's interesting is there are watches I've got from 2016 where we cannot source the parts.
Right.
Not our watches, but other
Sure.
brands.
Sure.
And these are big Swiss brands.
Sure.
And I'm
Sure.
thinking 2016. Not even a decade now, and
Yeah.
with the parts are obsolescent.
Yeah.
And personally, I think that's right. I mean, I'm glad you brought up Seth because he's an incredible guy. He is extremely busy now.
Sure.
But he can step back in 100 years' time, and that talks will go into legacy in a later part of this conversation. But I think that's so interesting that you said that about.
Sure.
I'm not going to be here forever.
Yeah.
But I want the watch to carry on.
Exactly, and I think that's an important part of it, and that's part of the reason why I make what I make. It's there is a bit of ego involved in being able to say I'm making a thing that people want and people find appealing, and also that that they find nice enough that they're going to hand on to somebody else or sell to somebody else who's going to enjoy it. And there's no reason why somebody can't continue to enjoy this watch for hundreds of years and continue to be able to use it.
And also they should do.
Sure.
So when someone's buying a watch from me, it should be something that's handed down in the family. And look, we talked about Amiga. I did an interview that last week with a vintage Amiga dealer, and he was saying that there are a lot of Amigas in drawers in places, still to this day. And generally, when people pull them out of the drawer and go, oh, I found this watch, they wind them, they work.
Yes.
And that's the sort of tolerances. And I always say to people, it's amazing if you had a car that hadn't been serviced for 20 or 30 years
Sure.
and you pulled it out of the garage and, oh, it works. That would be quite rare. So I think we underestimate the depth of engineering and reliability of these timepieces that are part of our heritage.
Absolutely. Yeah.
In your manufacturing, are there any tools or processes that I think people wouldn't expect you to use? And I think what I'm trying to get at is, once again, that sort of, I'm going to call it jelly mold. That's what they would call it probably in a thing. In other words, they think it's just there. Are there any process or tools? Because I always say to people, watchmaking is very hands-on. There's no robot. I don't believe there'll be a robot. I mean, maybe with quartz production, but I don't believe there'll be a robot that can do the entire process. But are there any tools or processes or materials that you use that people would be surprised? Because you talked about actually customizing your tools.
Yes, and so I'm not a purist in the tool sense where I sit there and say it has to be a tool that's 200 years old or it must be a tool that was done, that did this. I'm happy to work with some automation and some CNC equipment, for instance. There's certain things where it doesn't make sense for me to machine every single one of those things, where I can have a small CNC mill and I can produce a series of parts that are identical. And could I make those parts identical? Sure. Is it going to boost up the cost of the watch by 40%? Yes, if I made them all by hand, right? So there's some practical part there. Same thing when it comes to engraving. I use a fiber laser for engraving, the numerals and my name on the dial. Why? Because at the end of the day, it's going to produce a nice, beautiful, crisp engraving, which is going to look perfect and I'm going to be happy with. Unfortunately, I'm not Christian Lass. I'm not married to an incredibly gifted, hand engraver. Hannah is unbelievably gifted hand engraver. If I had her skill as a hand engraver, I would probably hand engrave my, the numerals on my dial, but I can't. So I'm taking a more pragmatic approach to that, and I'm using a fiber laser to do that. So I have one here, and that's what I do my dials with. In terms of the machining, a lot of what I do is on manual machines. So I have a small manual lathe in there, right? I use small manual mills for doing my milling work. That's all very, very traditional from that point of view. And then, from the rest of the tools, it's everything from hand files, a lot of files, more files than anybody ever wants to think about. Sandpapers, things, all of the things that you need to make a thing by hand, especially a piece of jewelry. You get used to all of those.
And the process of finishing that word, the one word, is encyclopedic, isn't it?
Absolutely. That's a whole. I mean, that is a whole career in and of itself, right?
Yeah.
And in fact, I have good friends who've made their entire career out of hand finishing, right? Like you take a look at somebody like a Philippe Narbel, right? His entire career, he began as a jeweler and then started working as a watch finisher, and now he has his own atelier where they do hand finishing work for some of the biggest customers in the world. It's again, I can do those things because I come from a jewelry background. I've been hand finishing metal for 25 years. I know how to do all those things. So it's a nice thing. I can bring all those skills to bear as well in what I'm doing.
But when you go back and look at the clock, as far as I understand, and please correct me, and if anyone's watching, correct me as well, most watchmakers and clockmakers would do everything themselves. Until about Thomas Earnshaw, when he started subcontracting, someone will do the dial, someone will do the case in his own workshop. Most watchmakers were doing everything. That's what they did.
I don't know. Yeah, that's a good question, and I don't know at what point people stopped doing it. I know there are, I know that there are famous clockmakers who were not making all their own clocks, right? They weren't making every part of it. The same thing with watchmakers. There are plenty of them who weren't making all of it. That's still a relatively modern thing, right? We don't, because we have access to the knowledge and everything to be able to do all of the things ourselves. So even then, having said that, I don't make my springs, right? I don't have the technology.
No, but you've said, in terms of the train, there's things that just wouldn't be worth. Wouldn't be worth making them.
Yeah, and so there's certain things that's not worth for me to make. But I'm happy to make all of these things myself, and I'm happy to work on all those things myself, and try and bring as many of my skills to bear on the different parts as I possibly can.
Yeah. So in your current production now, you're in the process of making the next series. We're still currently on this one series.
No, the first series is done. That was actually a watch where I used someone else's movement in it.
Right.
And for various reasons, I wasn't very happy with that process. In fact, for a lot of reasons, I wasn't very happy with that
We had
process.
a discussion at
You and I have had that conversation
We
before.
did.
So that's a thing that I've already been through. So at this point, I'm actually working on the prototype for my next watch. And this movement that I'm working on is one that I plan on continuing to use for years to come. I want it to be the basis of what I'm doing. And as I mentioned earlier on, being able to add complications, let's say a moon face to it. I'm designing this in such a way that I can do that. So the case is going to be a little thicker than it needs to be this time around, right? Why? Because I know that later on I want to continue using this case design, but I want to be able to have that extra millimeter of space in there to be able to add extra things into the movement to make it a bit easier to do that later on. So that's what I'm working on right now. I'm working on getting that first prototype finished so that I can then start showing it and start saying to people, okay, this is what I'm working on. Are you interested in it?
Right. So at the moment you've done design work? Right.
Yep.
So that's all ready to go. I don't know what Chris is going to be able to, because you're going to edit this video, so you can drop in. You're going to drop in what you can or cannot show. But I think the important thing to say, and you made a point, we talked about movement choices and we talked about the gear training, we talked about supply issues.
Sure.
Because I think there is an assumption, once again, that if you order something, and I'm going to be very careful as I say this, let's say from a renowned Swiss supplier,
Sure.
that what you're delivered doesn't need further work.
Sure.
And I've always said, even in our little way where we use movements, and I've always said, yeah, I can be sent any movement in the world. But if I don't have a good watchmaker
Right.
assembling that watch,
Right.
then I'm going to end up with something that isn't that great. So there's a lot of levels that need to be added on from the perceived wisdom, which is everything from that factory is brilliant.
So
We're being very political here, but
yes, without naming any names, one of the issues that I run into is that I'm a small maker, and I ordered 11 movements from a boutique Swiss, movement maker. I am absolutely their smallest client, and the way that they treat me reflects that, right? I'm paying more per movement than somebody else is. However, I'm still only ordering 11 movements from them. And so when it comes to things like, oh, these parts are failing, right? And the sliding pinion in the movements are failing because there was a QC problem when they manufactured those movements. How quickly are they going to respond to me, and are they going to get me a replacement part for it? When it takes 5 months to get a replacement part, like a replacement sliding pinion, I can't work in those sorts of environments. I need a more reliable client, or a more reliable supplier, I should say, to be able to get me those parts when something fails in that movement.
So, Chris, we were talking about the movements that you procured.
Yeah.
And even though they were from a very reputable and respected brand, or manufacturer, I should say, there's still a large degree that needs to be done by the watchmaker. And I think people forget that. They think that something comes from this well-known name, and they're a drop and go solution. And I think it's just not the case. The watchmaker has so much more to do to take those not even raw components, to take those movements.
Right, and I could have just dropped that watch movement. And in fact, I know that there are brands out there, large brands that people know of, and they drop that movement straight into their watch as it comes from the factory. That's fine. If that's what they want to do, that's great. But for me, I wasn't happy with a lot of it, right? So for instance, the finishing that's on it wasn't good enough for what I wanted in my watch. So I sat down and I spent tens of hours on each movement, refinishing each movement. And again, that's something where I can take the skills that I learned as a jeweler. I know how to finish, how to do high finishing on metal.
Yeah.
I could do that, and I could take those parts and I could turn them back into something.
And also, they'd be
nice.
Chris Manning finishing.
Exactly.
Yeah, I've seen your work, and it's not, I would say, has a very personal touch.
Right. So, for instance, I'm a big fan of playing with different textures, and that's something that people in the watch industry don't do enough of. And so, for instance, the plates that were in that watch, they were sandblasted, right? Which again, a lot of people use various sandblasting techniques, everything from glass beads to various micro abrasives. I chose to use a crushed ruby when I sandblasted those, because it has a very different look to it than a standard matte finish that you get from sandblasting.
Yeah.
All those little details, those are what are important to me, because they're what make it my watch. The new watch that I'm working on now, again, all of the details are a little bit different than what other people might do, because again, I'm coming to it from a different background.
And I think what's interesting, and I'm going to add a question here for you.
Yeah.
Do you think that people understand more today what an independent adds than they did 5 years ago? Because you're talking
100%.
about a lot of work. I mean, hours and hours and hours of work.
Yes. And I'm very fortunate that I'm coming into this industry at a time when other independents have come before me, right? I mean, really, when we think about people like the Daniels of the world, the Jorns, the Voutilainens, the Grubel Forzis, all of these guys, the Vianney Halters, like all of these guys who've done a lot of the hard work of introducing people to, this is what an independent is. This is the sort of thing that we bring, that a large multinational brand that you've heard of that advertises on the side of an F1 car does, right? That they're bringing something different to the industry than what we're bringing. So I'm very fortunate that I'm sort of following along and I'm standing on their shoulders, right? So yes, I don't have to explain to my customers, right, the people that are going to buy from me, I don't have to explain to them, what is an independent watchmaker? Why are you charging so much for this work?
Yeah.
Right?
They appreciate and understand more. And of course,
Absolutely.
you communicate more with the customer, showing them what you're doing.
Absolutely.
Now, I think we talked about before about this individuality and about the way you produce. So you're only producing a small series of watches.
Sure.
So that's 10, maybe 12 watches
Yes.
in this series.
Yeah.
We talked about the waiting list, and
Yes.
I think we covered that. But just from your point of view, just explain why you're not comfortable with a long waiting list that runs into years and years.
So there's a few issues with a long waiting list, and part of it is my level of comfort. I find it stressful to have money from people who've said, I want one of your watches, I want, whatever it is you're making. I don't want to be holding on to that money for a long period of time without giving them something, right? So part of it is it makes me uncomfortable doing that. It's also frustrating for them because they're waiting multiple years for this watch, right? I don't want them to be sitting there waiting multiple years for it. At most, I never want somebody to be waiting for more than a year for something that I'm making, unless it's unbelievably complex. But that's a conversation that I can have with that client.
Yeah, absolutely.
On top of that, it's frustrating as I've been in that position where I've been on a multi-year waiting list. I hate it. I know that I'm not going to be able to buy something immediately from an independent, but I don't want to have to wait a decade for it.
Yeah.
The other problem is that I don't want to be making this watch 10 years from now. I'm happy with I've got a regulator version of this watch, a regulator dial version of it, and I have a sort of standard 3-hander time-only version of it. I'm happy with these designs right now. I'm happy to make 10 or 12. I don't want to make 50 of them. I don't want to make 80 of them.
Yeah.
And 10 years from now, I don't want to be making this watch. I'm already designing the watch that I want to be releasing at the end of next year. It's a different case style. It's a different design. It's a different dial. And I know what that looks like in my head. I'm excited to make that watch. If I commit to making 60, 70, 80 watches, I'm not going to be making that watch for years. And I need to have that to be able to exercise those designs.
But don't you think? I agree with you entirely. With this watch we're doing, we're almost sold out. But I've said to people, it's a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Yes.
And we move on. And I
Yes.
think that even the biggest brands, and I use brand advisedly,
Yeah.
they do now make their products not exclusive by sort of you just can't buy it, but they make it. We've made a run, and it's gone. And I think that not only protects your creative juices, if I may say that, is
Yes.
creative society, but also protects the customer as well. And I don't think they're worried about being on that journey. And I'm sure, like with what we do, where we have multiple return customers, they're happy to be on that journey because you've done this, and that's
Absolutely.
one chapter. We don't want to be making Jaws 3.
This is the thing. There's so many examples of people beating a dead horse,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
I don't want to be doing that.
Yeah.
And having spoken to a number of people at Watches and Wonders, a number of independents who've committed to making even 24 watches, and they're all sitting there like, I wish I hadn't done that.
No.
Right? I wish that I had only committed to 10 watches because, again, it's a chunk of time that I can sit there. I know how long it's going to take me to make 10 watches. Even if I run into problems, even if I struggle making those 10 watches, I know that I can make those 10 watches in a reasonable period of time. If I start saying 25 watches, like, okay, how long is that going to take me?
Yeah, and I think there's something you just touched on there, and I think it's important that we just stress this for people. This is quite a small community. Even though we're at different ends of the spectrum, Chris and I will still have quite a lot of conversations about dials, about production, about the stresses and strains.
Sure.
And you talked about going to Switzerland. I'm thinking back in the old days of Basel.
Yes.
Or going to the clockmakers dinner. Or we were talking about this sort of how you get interesting conversations with people. So we were talking before about going somewhere like a clockmaker's dinner and seeing the most extraordinary, I'm not going to say rare or exclusive, I'm going to say really interesting and fascinating timepieces that you wouldn't see anywhere else.
Yes.
And you talked about having the dinner and seeing.
Oh yeah, well, there was one dinner last year where there were 10 Frodsham wristwatches in the room.
Yeah.
Well, if you wear that watch and you wear it into any other room in the world at any other dinner, you are going to be not only the only person wearing that watch, but probably the only person who's ever seen that watch.
Yeah.
But then at a dinner like that, all of a sudden it becomes the most common watch in the room, which is hilarious. But then you also see, I was sitting beside Stephen Forsey at dinner one night, and he's showing me the prototype of the Quad Tourbillon that they did. Right. Well, where else are you going to see those sorts of things? And being able to have a conversation with him about that is nice. And so again, yes, we talk to people all the time. I spend a lot of time talking with David Walter in California. We regularly talk about our designs. We regularly talk about the challenges we have in what we're making. And so it's a very collaborative process from that point of view, in that we get to talk to each other, and we're all doing the same work, right? So
I think we talked as well about, I mean, when I was at Basel one year, and there was that hotel, and I can't remember, they keep changing the name of the hotel. And there's a little bit in the foyer where everyone sat together on the small tables. And I remember sitting there with Richard and Maria Habring, and they it's a husband and wife team, as we're a husband and wife team, and they sat there, and it was only about 10 minutes into the conversation when they started talking more, because they realised that you know what you're talking about.
Yes.
And then people are very free with the information.
Absolutely.
They're very open and honest. And I think that's something I want to stress, particularly with someone lovely like Chris, but also doing these videos. We're in a small community. We are supporting each other. And there's an extraordinary depth of knowledge that we can pull upon. Mm-hmm. We're not competing. We're not in the same realms.
But even amongst other sort of independents that I am competing with, I've walked into workshops, and some slightly larger companies where there's a dozen people working there. And I remember walking into one workshop, and the owner looks at the maker that's in the shop and says, any question that Chris asks, answer it. There are no secrets in here.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that idea of there are no secrets amongst us I've seen that in so many workshops, whether it's like Philippe Narbel, he high-end finishing, right? He's created a career of doing unbelievably high-end finishing on movements. I went to his workshop for a couple of days a few years ago, and again, he's like, ask me any questions. I will answer any question you have about how I'm making things. And when people come and ask me about what I'm doing, I'm happy to answer any questions about what I'm doing, because I know that that's how I got into this. I got into this because of people sharing knowledge.
And I think the knowledge goes two ways.
Yes.
So we can talk about things, and even though we're working in different fields, there's things that you say like, okay, that's interesting. Did you know this?
Yes.
And did you know this?
Yes.
So I think it is quite collaborative.
Yeah.
And I think we're lucky to have it. And I just want to stress that behind all the big brands and the marketing and the F1 cars, as you said, there are genuine people here who it is their life's passion. We touched on the subject about, if we wanted to make huge money, we'd be doing other things.
Absolutely. Yes. Absolutely. I'm not doing this for the money. I do this because I have to. I need to make things, right? Yeah. I'm an obligate maker. I need to be making things. And that's important. I can't just sit at a desk all day. I've done that job before.
Yeah.
It drove me crazy, and I couldn't do that. And again, while I don't want to make 300 watches or 200 watches in the rest of my life, but I need to make something. I need to continually design and make things.
Yeah, exactly. Now, just to touch on this, so I want to just say Chris has very kindly invited us into his studio, and we are right at the beginning. And I think the timing is pretty much perfect, because we're talking about a watch that we haven't seen yet. We haven't seen it. So I just want to give Chris the opportunity to tell people how they can see what's happening.
Yes. So the best ways of seeing what I'm doing right now are to follow me on Instagram. Instagram has been such a boon for our industry, especially since COVID. COVID was great with Instagram, being able to share what was going on. So there are two places on Instagram. One is the cmmanning.watches, and that's where I'm putting all of the sort of the publicity photos, the finished pieces. That's where you're going to be able to see past work that I've done, the past watch that I've released, that sort of thing. If you follow me on Instagram under silver_hand, that's where most people probably follow me today if they know me. And that's an account that I've had for a very long time. I've been sharing my processes of, some of my travels, some of the things that I'm making over the years. And that's where I tend to share the behind the scenes of what's going on. So while the cmmanning.watches account is not going to have very much about this watch for a while, starting in the next month, you're going to start seeing on my Silverhand account the behind the scenes. You're going to see some of the renders of my watch, right? You're going to see the dial designs. You're going to see the case designs. You're going to see me actually making and turning parts. So that's the sort of place, if you're really interested in what's going on and what happens, that's the best place to follow me.
And I think it's really interesting. You will want to follow Chris there, because I've seen some of the work you've done here today. And I think you will really understand the individuality that you're trying to work with. There's something there that you'll look at, it'll go in the back of your mind, and you'll come back to it a day later and go,
sure,
actually, what was that? And I think there's a lot of interesting and innovative features that you're working on. I've seen them, so it's really exciting with that. So do follow Chris on that. We'll be following Chris's journey. We'll be having some customer get-together, friend get-togethers in the coming months. Chris, please join us. And
Absolutely.
bring with if you want anything we're working on. But I just want to stress that all of us as independents are working together, whatever part of the market we're in. We're all talking, we're all learning. Certainly Chris and I in a pub in Marylebone had a long conversation about movement choices, about Amiga and about various other brands and about our work with it. And even little ideas like you talked before about cases, you're leaving enough room in the case. And I think there is this trend at the moment to make smaller and smaller watches, but that adds more complications. And even with what we've done, I can see that by leaving less room around the movement and less tolerances, you've got pressure on the rotor, you've got pressure on the stem. You add more complications. So these are the sort of conversations that we have to perfect our art, I'm going to be saying.
And one of the advantages of making these sorts of things myself and doing this design work myself is that I can make those forward-thinking choices. I know what I'm going to be doing. I know the watches that I'm going to be making over the next 5 years. I've already started designing them in my head. In some cases, I already have sketches of them. I already have 3D models of some of them. And I can think ahead and say, all right, I really want to have a moon phase complication in one of my watches. Okay, well, what do I need to do that? Okay, well, I need a little bit of extra space in the movement because I'm going to be putting that between the movement and the dial. Well, I can start to do that now. I can make those design choices today, leave a millimeter of extra space in there, and just so that I have that room to be able to play around with. And so all of these design choices that I'm making now are helping me farther down the road to be able to do what I want to do in the future.
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting because there's such a lot that goes into these watches. And as you said, they are little treasures, that micro-engineering that sit on our wrists and we can enjoy and admire literally every hour and every minute of every day.
Yeah, they're little works of art and they're absolutely fabulous to see. And they're the sorts of things that we should be able to enjoy for our lifetime, but also in the future as well. I mean, there are plenty of examples of watches that are old. I mean, you walk through the British Museum. They have an incredible collection there of watches and clocks over the last 800 years. Same thing with the clockmakers collection at the Science Museum here in London. An incredible collection of watches and clocks that are there. And again, all that DNA has pulled through time, and we're still, watches have not changed dramatically, and it's nice to be able to keep making things that are part of that tradition.
Yeah, and I think that's what we love. Well, thank you, Chris. Thank you very much for allowing me to come to your studio, and hopefully we're bringing more from Chris very, very soon.
Thank you.
It's only with your support that we can do what we love, so please don't forget to like and subscribe, and please comment below. Chris and I really want to hear what you have to say, and it's great to share these incredible moments with you.